The end of the first part of the lecture, we were talking about the SCSD, this program in California to build new schools out of prefabricated sort of kit of parts. And that was part and parcel of a movement in California to think also about solving the problem of housing using similar strategies, taking industrially produced building components and using those not to build schools, but instead to build houses. And in particular, there is one program that's worth looking at in some detail, both for what it achieved in terms of designing and building a series of prototype houses, and its influence both stylistically in the sense that we think of a quote-unquote case study house today, or a post-war modern house, mid-century modern house, but also in terms of where it sort of fell short in terms of the idea that this could produce mass housing. There was a magazine in California called Arts and Architecture that was taken over by a publisher and editor named John Intenza in 1938. And Intenza's idea was that California is this kind of new frontier, offers new progressive ways of thinking, and the sort of eclectic, like Spanish colonial regionalism that was kind of endemic to California residential architecture was something he felt the culture could sort of push back against. At the end of World War II, Intenza buys a plot of land on the coast just outside of Los Angeles and decides to put together a housing exhibition to demonstrate what a kind of new industrialized housing project could be. A couple get built there, but throughout Los Angeles, the Arts and Architecture case study program builds 13 houses over the next 4 years. These are designed to be both exhibited but also then sold, and they prove to be incredibly popular. Arts and Architecture publishes the designs along with essays by the designers talking about their ideas of matching industrial production to the problem of the house. And these houses also all sell at much more than anyone expects them to. The magazine, you see a handful of covers on the left, so very clearly in this kind of modernist mode of graphic design, but also thinking seriously about modern architecture as a scientific practice. You can see in the center and on the right an issue of Arts and Architecture that's guest edited by some names that'll become familiar over the next few lectures. Charles and Ray Eames, Eero Saarinen, Richard Buckminster Fuller, and Herbert Matter. And you can see that here is one of these essays where the designers are explaining the philosophy behind what they're doing. The architects of the prefabricated house, in this case, Charles and Ray Eames, are saying you have to both study human behavior, you have to figure out what the goals are that you're trying to achieve. You have to be a scientist, not just a social scientist, but also a materials scientist, matching the available steel and new materials like aluminum to the problems that the post-war family presents to you. You have to be an economist, thinking about how these are going to be affordable or how you're going to provide these houses for a cost that a middle-class family can afford. And then finally, you have to be an industrial engineer. You have to think about where all of these prefabricated elements are coming from, how they're being made, where they're being made, how they not only get manufactured, but also how they get brought to the site and how they get assembled. On the far right, this is a graphic by Charles and Ray Eames that basically is kind of an illustration of the course's fundamental principle, right? That there is, on the left, the kind of function that one needs, and on the right, the kind of resources that one has to match that function. So understanding family behavior, at the same time having a vocabulary of materials and technology, bringing these together and thinking through them in terms of economics. How can we most efficiently or most cost effectively address these problems with this range of materials and technology? Then thinking about how to mass produce them so that we're able to tackle this problem at scale, and distributing it. How do we get it out into the world? You can see too that beneath the family, right, the kind of heart of the process, there are other places that Charles and Ray Eames think the designers thought in the most broad sense possible could be put to work, right? Like, how do we finance single-family houses? How do we service them? How do we repair them? How do we keep them operational? These are all things they think that might get brought into the endeavor of using prefabrication to address issues of housing in post-war California. So the case study houses stem from an earlier project in arts and architecture, one of several that in the middle of World War II is thinking about what the post-war era might be like, what the possibilities are, in addition to what the problems that have to be solved are. So here you see a couple of schemes for architects and designers thinking about how this new industrial capacity that everyone sees coming could get put to use to match the needs for housing. A very young I.M. Pei in the upper left is thinking about modularity, standardization, also thinking about transport. You can see that these panels that the cartoon figures are assembling are coming out of a container that's clearly been on the back of a truck. On the right, a couple of architects thinking through the kind of details of prefabrication. How do you put shop fabricated wall panels together? How do you tighten them? How do you insulate and waterproof them? Insulation, not the biggest problem in California, but one that nonetheless architects are forced to think about. So in 1946, the case study house project starts. Arts and Architecture commissions a local architect builder named J.R. Davidson to do the first one. And even though this is a relatively tame experiment compared with some of what's about to come, you can see a lot of the basic techniques already at play. One is modularity. It's set out on a grid. The other is thinking through the kind of what post-war living is going to be like. So bigger, open, multi-use spaces, kitchens that are more front and center in the living spaces, so a greater connection between preparing food and eating or entertaining. A garage, which had not been a standard feature in pre-war housing, but which absolutely is going to be a factor in post-war housing, especially in Los Angeles. And space for things like utilities, furnaces, things like that are off-the-shelf mechanical systems. Davidson's design is pretty basic when it comes to the construction. It's largely timber. It's done with a wooden truss, and as you can see, a ridge pole, a sort of low-slope roof. But nevertheless, he's thinking through how you might manufacture multiple timber trusses, how you might use those in multiple housing, and how everything is standardized. You can see where the walls that divide the living room from the dining room and things like that are going to be hooked to the truss, right? So there's modularity, there's standardization, et cetera, et cetera. The first few case study houses are relatively tame. Some of them use steel. The one that really grabs people's attention is by Charles and Ray Eames, and it is case study house number 8. These are the what's published in Arts and Architecture, and you can see that it's a steel truss that makes this kind of box that sticks out from the side of a hill. You can see that the program is a married couple occupied professionally with mechanical experiment and graphic presentation. We'll get around to that here for a bit. If you read the text, there's a really interesting sense of what what post-war life is likely to be like. Work and play, concentration or relaxation, intermingled personally and professionally. They're saying basically that the residents are apartment dwellers. They aren't handy people necessarily, so they don't want a lot to maintain. They want it to be sort of simple, easy to take care of. And the house, they say, should be a background, right? It should be a framework for a life and work. Charles and Ray Eames work with Eero Saarinen to do a neighboring house. This is case study house 9. You can see that it has a lot of the components that we've seen in the post-war school building. So open web trusses, standard W-shaped sections just right off the rolling mill. And you can see too that they're interested in integrating it with landscape, with finding ways to work in a kind of modular structure so things can get moved in and out. And you can see too that there's an interest in thinking through post-war life and what the nuclear family is going to be, how that nuclear family is going to be different maybe than it would have been in the pre-war era. Here, this kind of famous conversation pit in this one, the case study house 9, that becomes a sort of standard feature in a lot of homes in the 60s and 70s. And you can see mass-produced furniture. The Eameses are very interested in thinking through a kind of continuum of design, from furniture all the way to houses and urban planning. So you see some of their chairs and sofas in the back. The Eameses think through the idea that the house could be completely prefabricated and industrially produced. For a hardware company called Kwikset, they do a prototype house that they say you could basically make in a steel production plant, put onto a truck, and ship out to the job site or the subdivision very quickly. It doesn't progress very far, but it's one of several projects to think through the factory-produced house in a new way. One of the more intriguing figures in the case study era is a builder named Craig Ellwood, who has come out to California to sort of seek his fortune after growing up in Texas. He's not trained as an architect. His education basically comes from job sites, putting up houses, a lot of them California Spanish colonial style, but also increasingly a number of modern houses. Ellwood reads about Mies van der Rohe in particular, gets kind of obsessed with Mies's style, and begins thinking through how to take the kind of Miesian aesthetic and to marry it to the ideas of the case study project. This one is not an actual case study house, but it's very much in the spirit. And you can see that Ellwood on his own is doing some of the same things, taking ready-made steel right out of the rolling mill, doing minimal fabrication to it, laying out houses on standard modular grids, using a sort of kit-of-parts approach to both the cladding, the glazing, and the structure. The details here are super simple. They're details that you could never do maybe anywhere other than California, where the weather is always pretty benign. But there's also a kind of minimalism to it, right? The idea that the house is both attractive, but also that it recedes into the background, as the Eameses say, that it doesn't sort of intrude on daily life. It's sort of a support framework for all the things that are going to go on inside of it. Ellwood does eventually get commissioned to do some of the later case study houses, and you can see that there is both this interest in expressing the materials, expressing the technology, but marrying it to a very kind of Miesian style. And this, I think, is where a lot of what we think of today as mid-century modern comes from, is case study houses, but also Ellwood's approach in particular. Here, one in Beverly Hills, a little bit later in the sequence, and you can see that the elements are all there, but Ellwood's able to find a lot of variety. Some of that variety comes in the form of finishes, so the vertical timber, which is kind of a new material for the case study program, colors and the textiles, also thoughts about this being California, connecting the inside and outside. So even though there's a glass wall there, the timber kind of running through it makes the case that with mechanical systems and all that, we can have this sort of continuity through the glass that maybe we couldn't before. When you dissect those very stylistic houses, though, you still find these very, very rough, like off-the-shelf kit-of-parts details. Ellwood is really obsessed with using steel just as found, right out of the rolling mill, with only the kind of minimal amounts of fabrication to it, right? Cut it, maybe you weld it into a frame, maybe you weld plates to a steel column so that you've got something to attach the concrete masonry unit walls to, but not doing anything fancy in terms of shaping it, right? Using the steelwork especially as a kind of found object. There is brick here, right? Concrete masonry in particular is something that Ellwood uses. Relatively small scale, but you can see that you can imagine the steelwork going up very quickly, brickwork taking a lot more time, right? And it's there in large part for its insulation value, also for its kind of nod toward a single traditional material. It's almost a luxury item. You can think about it as a kind of texture or a kind of aesthetic choice that's within a much cheaper, quicker steel frame. And some of these become really iconic. This is one of Ellwood's better-known houses in the hills outside of Los Angeles, where he's thinking about some of the same ideas of inside and outside, but in kind of dramatically different ways. And if you look, you can see that this is both a kind of bridge structure, but when you look inside, it has all the kind of soft textiles. It has a couple of Mies van der Rohe chairs. It has a couple of Charles and Ray Eames chairs. So thinking about combining kind of a highly stylized lifestyle with these kind of found objects, right? The industrially produced house structure. Pierre Koenig is one of the later case study house architects, and he sort of extends the vocabulary a little bit. All of the same principles are there. Now it's a 2-car garage instead of a 1-car garage by 1958, but you can see that it's still modular, and it's all still taking on the same idea of using steelwork as found, trying to find industrial materials for things like exterior walls, and finding architecture within the system. So you'll notice here, for instance, that all of the windows in the house either look to the north, where you get sort of free daylight without solar gain, or to the south, where you can easily shade the windows and keep the sun off in the summer. All of that means that the house has a kind of grain to it, right? A really, really strong directionality to it. Koenig is trying to find a kind of architectural rigor within the technical rigor that's already there. And you can see both from the exterior, where the detailing is very raw, but also very well thought through. And you can see on the interior where, again, you're seeing the raw steel, but it's all very composed, right? Very thought through architecturally. Here, too, you can see that there is a modular kitchen. All of those pieces are on the same dimensions, so when you need to replace the stove or the dishwasher, it's easy to do. You can see, too, that he's using factory-produced furniture. These are Saarinen chairs made out of fiberglass, new material that Koenig thinks is certainly appropriate to the way that living is going to happen in the post-war era. But even though the house is very sophisticated, when Koenig writes about it, he's talking about an economy not only in materials, using inexpensive factory-produced materials, limiting the palette, thinking about how the house can be put together quickly on site. He's also thinking about a kind of economy of design. So this orientation of the house, right, relentlessly kind of north-south, means, Koenig says, that you only have 2 details too, right? You only need to draw through the junction between the steel frame and the solid wall on the east and west sides, and the steel frame and the glass wall on the north and south sides. 2 details, minimum set of drawings, a minimal number of actions that the crew needs to perform on the job site. And he says, because the materials are steel, because they're lightweight, because they don't take up a lot of room, you get minimum house, actual solid structure, the thing that costs money, maximum space, what you're actually aiming for, right? Places where people can actually live. The legacy of the case study houses is a bit mixed. They end up producing a lot of one-offs, dwellings for relatively wealthy people that, even though they may use cheap materials, are often sold at a huge markup. The original case study houses all go for twice their asking prices. But there are developers who take these ideas and turn them into financially viable kind of middle or upper middle class subdivisions. The Eichler company is one of these. They build subdivisions throughout the Bay Area and throughout Los Angeles, where they literally do use the ideas of the case study houses to build these mass-produced steel-framed houses that are both inexpensive to construct and yet very, very desirable, right? These are some of the sort of classic mid-century modern houses that, even though they're built for a middle-class audience, today go for, $500,000 or $1 million easily, in part because of their stylistic legacy. The idea of the case study houses also spreads kind of far and wide. So even 20 years after the original program, you see British architects like Michael Hopkins building what is essentially a case study house for his family in London. The idea that expressed technology, expressed industrialized materials can be appropriate not only for factories, but also for places where people actually live is a key kind of jump in the post-war sensibility. A lot of these architects, Ellwood, the Eameses, Saarinen, will come to be influential on a movement that gets called high tech in the 60s and 70s. Hopkins is certainly in this sort of lineage. And those early houses are really some of the first efforts at finding this balance between industrially produced materials and the desire to lead like well-styled lives that reflect kind of new realities of the post-war era. We'll look at another couple of materials that are key to the growth of prefabrication of the post-war era in the final part of the lecture, and look ahead to how these get applied to not only residences, single-family residences, but also to larger scale public housing and to larger and larger projects, especially commercial buildings that in a later lecture we'll look at as the kind of post-war skyscraper develops in some similar ways to the way that these post-war houses have developed.